Well, good morning. I'm excited that you all chose to join us today. One of the things that I always like to do is get a sense of what it is you're looking to take away from today. Anybody, and I know I'm asking for audience participation at a very early time in the morning, but any reasons you chose this? You're like, man, I'm really excited about learning X. Or I could just, yes.
For myself, it's because that's an initiative in colleges right now is hitting that gap for students who are at risk.
Mm-hmm. And how's the institution looking at addressing that?
I know that they are asking our application developer to create a program to make it easier for faculty to report students that are at risk.
Okay. Very common, early alert style interventions. Let's see if we can get the computer back functioning here. See if that's... So early alert style interventions with faculty or other staff members, that's kind of a key initiative and driver at the institution. Anyone else?
What process is the work in to get better than 25% faculty participation?
If I could crack that nut for you, then we're in really good shape, right? Because it's a challenge. I think one of the things that's really important as we talk about this, and no matter what technologies that we provide or that your institution can provide, there's some element of intervention that's involved, right? There's an action that has to take place. I like to say data alone has never retained anyone, right? It's the action that results from that information that makes all the difference in the world. It really begins to move the needle. And we'll talk about some of these components as we move through. I am having all kinds of technical problems today. So as we get going, how many of your institutions, show of hands, how many of your institutions have created your institutional research offices, your admissions offices, have created opportunities to begin to identify the kind of risk factors at the institution? They can kind of paint a profile of, average GPA that one could expect, or these types of students tend to do well at our institutions. You all have those kind of models in your admissions offices?
Somewhat. Purdue University, we developed some software that started tracking students who are at risk. Would like a lot more comprehensive analysis across the institution rather than just fitting this in certain classes.
Yeah, and institutions are pretty well adept, I would say. A lot of institutions that I get a privilege to work with are really well at creating those big blocks of students, right? They can look and say, hey, we know that students who come from certain socioeconomic backgrounds are further than 50 miles away from the campus at the institution, or that had low admittance scores. Those students are our general risk students, right? We know right away when they walk in the door that those students are particularly, in the yellow or in the red, right? Those students are potentially down a path that doesn't set them up well for success. The challenge is not in necessarily how does the institution deal with those groups of students. They can identify them fairly well. It's what do you do once you've identified that student and what works for that individual student to really begin to better understand the situation that's at hand. It's not a matter of just saying, hey, we know this block of students is there, but we know that these individual students really need to kind of look for an answer, or look for an opportunity to help those students be successful. And that's what we try to do. You're trying to look for those kind of individual combinations so that as you're working with your faculty members, right, to create opportunities for them to alert you to performance or to alert you to students who haven't been seen, it's to be able to provide that student with immediate feedback, or to be able to provide an advisor or another person in what I'd call the student support network with information geared to help them turn that into action, turn that into an opportunity for a discussion, opportunity for kind of resource allocation and resource availability opportunities. I don't know what's going on with my PowerPoint here. Teach me a lesson about PowerPoint. So as you look at those things, one of the things that as we worked with campuses like Northern Arizona University and other institutions in this process is looking at the fact that when we identify those students, when we capture that data can be a powerful opportunity for us to take action. But that data has some limitations, right? The way your institution probably looks at and houses and functions around data looks a lot like a pie chart, right? There's little slices of that data from systems like your ERP system, your SIS system, your learning management system, all the assessments that you're doing, all of those data points are there, and typically a variety of different campus departments own or have control of that information, right? It's not centrally located, and even if your institution has a centrally located kind of data source, the real kind of question is, I bet most of what I would call the experiential data of your campus never gets to that data warehouse, right? And I'm talking about all of the event attendance that students are going to for programs and services that are happening outside the institution, when they're visiting various offices or locations on campus. Even their potential learning outcome data is not necessarily driving into those particular components. And if you don't think that that information is really kind of powerful, you'd probably be wrong, right? Like, that information is helping us understand how are students interacting in that kind of ecosystem that the campus is providing. So as we look at those opportunities and really beginning to think about the data, we have to think about data more like the student experiences the data on your campus, right? So if we look at the institutional lens, it's siloed. It's often in various segments. If we look at how the student provides you that data, those silos don't exist, right? That student goes to class. That student walks from their residence hall. That student goes to the advising center. That student walks to another office on campus. They attend an event or a program. They come back and go to sleep, whatever the case may be of their day. Their day touched all of the silos, but that student didn't think that happened at all, right? They thought, hey, I went to all these things that Purdue offers. They didn't think, oh, well, that's student affairs, so when I give them this data, here's the information I'm giving them. And oh, when I'm over here in a course, or I'm in the learning management system, oh, I'm giving this data to academic affairs, and I just expect you'll help me independently. They expect that we'll help them comprehensively in that type of an approach. And so we have to really begin thinking about the opportunities that provides us along the way. So one of the kind of aspects that we look at, and I think is a really good kind of component, if I can get any kind of PowerPoint offering here. One of the kind of really powerful opportunities we look at is the work of Vincent Tinto. Right? Tinto suggests that there are 4 conditions that are really powerful for a campus to begin that process of helping create an environment, a support area for students to be successful. And when you look at these kind of 4 areas that we talk about, it's really the combination of the programs and the services and the actions of your campus and your administrators, your faculty, with kind of what's powerful with your students from a data perspective to help further support those conditions and make them more robust and start connecting opportunities. And one of the things that I see And maybe your campus may or may not be like this, I don't know, I won't ask you, or if you do raise your hand, I'll assume you're talking about a colleague's institution. But how many of you have seen an example of an assessment report or some kind of finding at your institution that says, I'm going to pick on living learning communities. Students who participate in our living learning communities had a 25% higher GPA rate than the typical, first year cohort, and their retention rate was 5% higher than the typical first year cohort. And then you'll flip through the next paper will be like, oh, students who attended our extended orientation program have a 25% higher GPA than the typical freshman, and they have a 3% higher retention rate. All these things are really good. Our programs are great. That's fantastic. The problem is we're oftentimes not looking at the interaction effect, right? How many of those students who are in living learning communities also attend your extended orientation? And is it actually the combination of those factors that make a big difference, or is it the individual kind of components there that are working together? And that's why it's imperative for us to really begin thinking about the opportunities of putting that data together in kind of a different way, to think about it from a different kind of standpoint. That those programs that you're offering, the data that are getting generated, are helpful to both student and to faculty along the way. So as we look at this, those four kind of conditions, one of those conditions is called setting expectations, right? Tinto talks about the fact that it's important. It's my computer that's not, that's not working.
Can you manually advance?
No, I can't. We'll see if it restarts. It's a beautiful presentation, by the way. It's fantastic. Knock your socks off. Hopefully this works. So as you start thinking about the expectations, creating those clear expectations are important. And I think you see that when it comes to things like degree audit systems, right? Like when you start looking at the degree audit, the plan as the University of, I believe it was Washington, was talking about, the ability for you to lay out a plan for students to be successful, and an ability for them to kind of see where they are, chart their course. That's important. What we're also starting to see from campuses are the ability for them to think beyond the structure that's there. So we have campuses who are starting to work to call what we call a co-curriculum. It's kind of a blended environment of the ability to start linking key aspects of programmatic intervention with things like academic or operational opportunities to engage in the learning process. So we see that start to happen at places like Catholic University does an extended orientation program. They utilize this technology, they utilize this capability to say, look, it's not a 1-week program, it's not a 1-day or 2-day program, it's actually a 6-week program that we're starting to put in place. And what we want to do is recognize that we can efficiently deliver that and track progress of students beginning to make that process take place and take shape in that environment. It's also being utilized for creating expectations around credentialing and beginning to look at how we can set learning areas for students, whether it's in skills that we want them to take away to help support their environment and help them support their opportunities, or whether it's in other kind of endeavors to really help support and engage that learning environment. And again, all of that data that's getting generated helps feed the institution more information. It also helps feed the student with more information. They can see their progress, they can chart where they are, and the institution can begin to make that endeavor take place. So we see that happening. In fact, this is an interesting trend. We've seen an over 104% increase in the number of campuses that are beginning to look at structuring programs that they generally looked at and thought about from kind of a different mode of delivery aspect. So looking at it from a standpoint of, I have no idea what's going on. Looking at it from a standpoint of how they can begin to use that information and then push that information then back to advisors. Okay, so advisors can see in real time where students are in that process of meeting those expectations, not just for their degree completion, but for programs related to living learning environments or related to other kinds of endeavors. So that aspect of things is a really powerful driving tool. The other thing that we see, kind of that begins to be available, and Tinto talks about in his approach, is creating support structures. You need to support students in the success process, and this is where things like early alert come into context. So we see that it's not the no. We see that process is the Boston one. So we see that process begin to take shape along the lines of how a student engages that network, right? So it's not a one-to-one relationship. That's one of the kind of aspects that we see, that it's not one-to-one. And that's oftentimes how behavioral and kind of institutional interventions work, right? We equip our advisor or one person on campus with information about how they're going to help a student. And we get them to really engage in that, and we want to equip them with everything. But we don't recognize that a student's actually connected to 4 or 5 different people. It's almost a network effect in that endeavor. So oh hey, this guy did this. Pause right there. This guy is a miracle worker. He exponentially took my presentation way beyond. Way beyond where I needed to go. There, we'll catch up. There we go. Hey, the conditions that support success. So expectations, creating support in that endeavor. We'll jump through. We've talked about kind of that first level of expectation and the kind of co-curricular aspect of things. We also we'll jump through. This is an example at Fort Hays State. They utilize something called TigerLink to kind of help get students on leadership programs or other types of kind of retention support efforts to help them engage with the institution. MindTracker at the University of Texas El Paso is a great example of this. They start to create expectations for students around key areas like career development, civic engagement from a very early standpoint to get them engaged and get them connected and set the expectation of what they expect for their students, not just from a standpoint of here's your degree, but here's what we expect of students who are at this institution. It's beyond just your academic credentials, it's your entire experience that we're beginning to look at and put in place. So support. Like we talked about, it's not a one-to-one relationship. When you look at a student, right, they're connected to many people in the process, and all of those people are interacting with that student. And equipping them and connecting them in that kind of network area, I think, is a really important and kind of viable tool that really needs to begin to be looked at. Like we were talking about, professors are a very viable entry point for information, right? They know whether the student's been in the class for 3 days, 5 days, 6 days, passing, not passing. All that information is at their fingertips. And if you could spread that information throughout the network effectively, then you can begin to catch people who have the right conversations who they can help the student with in that process. So connecting those students to their network is a really kind of important step of the process. Not only can the network share their information about what's happening effectively, but they can also begin to communicate and collaborate in order to best help the student. The Gates Foundation is really supportive of this type of work with an initiative called the IPAS, Integrated Planning and Advising Systems, that is really designed to try to help drive a unified student record so that we can kind of see the experience of a student through that process. We're privileged to be working with 2 schools, institutions that are working that process and being able to learn from them about their needs and how can we more effectively connect those networked relationships together. Because oddly enough, if I asked you, where in one of your systems does the advisor-student relationship live, probably nobody could tell me. It, in most places, doesn't exist. It's a mythical relationship that is somewhere in the ether of your campus systems, but it's actually probably somewhere in an Excel file somewhere on campus, right? Living on somebody's system. There's all the arts and science advisor connections. But You can bring that to life in a variety of different and interesting ways. And one of the ways that is kind of interesting is, again, this is just an example of engaging the network. You can engage faculty members by embedding kind of tools where they are so that they can connect to, say, course rosters or to other kind of endeavors and register things like excused absences and unexcused absences and trigger alerts and information to that network based off combination of those data factors. Northern Arizona University does a fantastic job at this. Their educational support services units and their kind of student services and success areas really begin to work well. They identify those students very early on that if you come from certain kind of profiles or certain high schools or any of the kind of traditional things you would think about, they recognize that they want to get you to resources, right? They know they have resources that can help you, but they also know they're limited. There are only so many of them that exist, and so many students, and so many, there's lots of students, and only so many kind of resources that can connect to them and touch them. So they started to think about how can you leverage those networks, and how can you provide them more information, and begin very early on to put people and connect people into the right places at the right times in order to put those components together for the institution. In fact, last year, they generated over 23,000 data points. Now, this sounds really large, right? What do you do with 23,000 data points? It's really huge. But these data points are also, at times, kind of expanding data points, right? So they can get into a conversation. They can alert someone about a student missing class and then actually see the follow-up chain of what's happened, right? Each one of those points are a data point that gets generated, but it gets generated into the network to be able to see and be able to respond to, whether it's an RA, they've engaged the resident assistant network, all the way to faculty members and academic advisors in that process, and almost everyone in between from an administrative standpoint. They really begin to think about, and they've worked collaboratively. The hardest part of this process, I will tell you, wasn't the technology. It was the collaboration that was needed to pull it off. They needed to work together and say, hey, we own certain pieces of data. Let's exchange that information. Let's work together in that process to help drive kind of the adoption opportunities that are there for students. Because as Aaron, who's the executive director, says, timely information leads to timely intervention, right? If I don't get this information for 6 weeks, guess what? It's 7 weeks before the student, that issue was addressed. It's 7 weeks before we're connecting to that student. But if I can equip people with information more effectively, if I can quickly identify the support services that a student needs, this actually begins through the orientation process. Students take an intake assessment that measures data around non-cognitive factors. Right, so they were able to identify demographic breakdowns that put students at risk, and they start funneling and connecting advisors to those students. Great example, at NAU, there's a large Native American population. They know that those students who come from those types of backgrounds have sometimes transitional issues at the institution. They want to equip those students very quickly, very, very effectively with the tools and the kind of resources they want to succeed. As just an example, what they do at the very beginning is they say, hey, we want to connect you to people in our Native American support services, right? So all of a sudden those connections are made. Advisors in that area are able to quickly reach out to those students, but then it expands. So they start looking at non-cognitive areas such as grit, right? Resiliency, the ability for you to bounce back from a challenge. And they begin to look at how those things and how students perform in those areas, even in the kind of entry to orientation, how that can equip them for the things they need to be successful in courses. And here's a good example of something that they learned from the data. I got a call one day and it was like, JD, we found something really interesting. And I was like, oh, great, well, please share. Yeah, this is odd. Can you tell us about the research here that you all have on this and other kind of components? We see this relationship that our students who are actually doing really well, they have really high GPAs or are expected to do really well, have really low resiliency scores. That doesn't seem right. And so we started talking about the conversation, and we quickly began to realize that it made all the sense in the world. Because students who have been academically successful most of their lives never had to bounce back from an academic struggle. right? And so they started going, that's right. Like, and they started realizing that when students were projected to do well, but that they had potentially a very low resiliency rate, they needed a different set of recommendations to engage with that student because they needed to equip that student very early on with potentially the realities of college or academic life. They needed to make sure that advisors knew that, hey, when that student may come to see you if you're a residence hall director, because you might be their first point of contact, recognize that what issue the student may have is related to their ability to just bounce back. And the conversation can be very different because it can be more than just, oh, so you didn't do well on a test and a lot of diagnosis to get there. You can be effective at beginning to reach out. And they saw that that type of timely information really began to help them have more informed conversations, right? They were able to effectively begin to get into that process. And it's been a kind of very interesting evolution because as they have began to ingrain this type of data use to inform action, they've begun to expand data use. Right? It wasn't just, oh, fill a dashboard and let me see what's going on. I want a bunch of red, yellow, and green indicators. It was, fill me with more information that can help me have more effective conversations. And let's talk about how that effective conversation began to take place. So assessment and feedback was kind of the next area, interestingly enough, that Northern Arizona looked at. They started thinking about, okay, we want to begin to look at this area that Tinto says about creating a supportive environment for our students to be successful. And one of those is that we need to give feedback, right? And we need to use that feedback in a variety of different ways. So examples, think about all the rubric data that your campus generates on a day-to-day basis. Think of all the survey data. Oh my. Think of all the survey data your campus generates, right? That is actually students telling you about their experience, right? This is students being graded on learning. They're demonstrating, they're showing you how they're doing on an assignment, in a course, in a test. That information is apparent. You're asking for it. Web-based, and you're getting all kinds of wonderful kind of student feedback evaluations. You're asking all kinds of survey data associated with that. All that experience data, the students telling you how they're doing in a class if it's a course evaluation, or how life is if they're talking to you about the on-campus residential experience or something along those lines. That data is powerful. Put it into the hands of the people who can have the conversation. So NAU really started looking at this very interestingly. So they started being able to trigger alerts based off the type of data that they were seeing from these kind of select surveys. They knew to go out and what information to begin to collect. And what they did is created this concept of a micro survey, right? They recognized that there was data that they were missing, that was slipping through, but they knew what some transition issues were. So in the first year, they recognized, look, in the fall, because of the style of institution we are, our location, for those of you who've never been there, it's Flagstaff. When you think about Arizona, you probably are not thinking about Flagstaff, right? You're thinking about cacti and the desert. Flagstaff, kind of the complete opposite of that, right? And so students who come from, let's say, Phoenix, it's a hour and a half, 2-hour drive, but a tremendous change in just climate, right? And so they begin to look at things like in the fall, it's actually, our biggest retention issues are about how you're connecting to the institution. It actually isn't your academics at this point. Like, right, we kind of know whether you're going to do well or bad. We've kind of figured out who typically does those things. But our biggest decision points are those. You can do really well academically at the institution, but at the fall, if you haven't connected to the institution, your flight risk, your retention risk at our institution goes way up. So they concentrated on this, and they said, okay, where are we collecting all of this data? And they recognized that they were having touch points with students all the time during the fall semester where that was taking place. So what they did is they created a 3-question questionnaire, equipped people who were having conversations. So again, whether these were resident assistants, whether these would be people in a particular office, to engage students in a mobile device kind of exchange. Say, hey, just while you're here waiting on this office, or I'm coming around to check on you for a floor meeting or whatever the case may be, here, just give us some feedback. And what they did is triggered combinations, answers to these questions, trigger alerts back into the support network so that those people can begin to take action, so that they can begin to have the follow-up conversations as quickly and as effectively as they can in that endeavor. So it's not just what was going on in the course and the type of kind of feedback they're getting back from faculty members, but it's also the feedback that they're getting from students themselves and beginning to leverage it. Now in the spring, they recognized it was a whole different set of issues. Your first to second year decision, so first semester to second semester, connection. your first year to second year decision completely changed. It's actually about your academics now. Because if you haven't gotten connected, if you haven't feel like you perform well, if you don't feel like your major's right for you, now that's a whole different set of issues, right? And now think about the side of the support network you need to engage. These aren't potentially your hall directors anymore that you need to engage. These are your academic advisors, your career consultants, those type of people on campus who are connected to that student, but now want to engage with this type of information that's available to them. So they started utilizing this information very, very differently. And what they've seen in their approach, as we talked about over the past several years, is they've seen their retention rate climb about 7%. Now, I'm going to tell you, it's not us. We don't do anything but provide a platform. It's the work that the campus is doing that's making all the difference. But they're able to better leverage the information in order to begin to have that outreach and have that opportunity. The next area of input that Tinto talks about is involvement. Right? Students need to get involved in their environment. So they need to have purposeful activities inside and outside of the classroom that they can engage in. And this was actually the next place that Northern Arizona University said, hey, wait a second. We're meeting with all these students, and it's a lot of them. And every time we're meeting with them, we're saying something along the lines of, you should go visit the insert blank, right? Like, you should go visit the Career Center. You should go visit the Tutoring Center. You should go visit the support service that you need. All of those things are offices or resources that we're directing you to. Their question was, well, how many of our students are doing that thing, right? And then they recognize, well, how are we actually collecting the data that helps us know whether those students are doing the things that we're asking them to do in the process? And how better equipped will our advisors be if we can have a follow-up that says, hey, I told you should have gone to the Career Center. I noticed you haven't gone. Maybe it's really busy or whatever, but I really encourage you should go there, right? Like that second follow-up, what are you communicating to the student? You care, right? And that can make a world of difference when it comes to that conversation. So they actually began thinking about, all right, where are all the places that we kind of connect to? So they actually started kind of centralizing their engagement activities. So everything that was kind of happening outside the classroom, whether it was student clubs and organizations, whether it was department events, and there's a lot of those connections that are going on in that process. So they started centralizing those things so that they could begin getting the data associated with it. Whether it was swipe card data at event attendance, whether it was participation in the clubs and the organizations, it didn't matter. They wanted to capture that information. Additionally, they're actually starting to think about now expanding that to the offices. How can we begin to integrate into the office in a non-disruptive way the ability for somebody to check in, right? I want to check into the financial aid office. I want to check into wherever this place may be, whether, again, that's card swipe or some other kind of technology to begin capturing that information. The power behind this is the ability then for the advisor, the support network, to actually see what the student is engaging in. So they can see that whether it's in the stream, they can see the check-ins at, say, the recreation center when that swipe card is taking place. Hey, the student's utilizing this type of information. Or whether it's kind of the activities that they're going to or involved in. So that an advisor can have, again, a very different conversation. Instead of, so, what are your interests? Have you gotten involved in any activities? And, kind of going down that path, they can begin having a conversation that says, hey, I see you're a part of the American Marketing Association. How's that going? Right? Oh, that seems really interesting. Your career is in political science, or your major is political science. You're in the Marketing Association. How are you going to start thinking about putting those two interests together in order, how does that fit for you? And how can we help you plan the degree, the experiences, the academic opportunities that can help you better mesh those two things together? It's a very different conversation to have when you're engaged with the student. The last kind of area, and Tinto has four, and far be it from me to, say to a master, maybe there's one more, but I'm going to, right? And that is that campuses need to be informed, right? They need to be informed in their process. So they need to make sure that they're learning organizations. I mean, one of the things that I loved that the keynote speaker was talking about is the concept of A/B testing. Right? My job is in product management. I love A/B testing. It's fantastic. I can put the button in a better place. I can, get people to do better actions. It's wonderful. Facebook, maybe they didn't do the right thing, and maybe that's going to stir up a whole pot of mess around this. But set that off to the side for a second. It's about experimentation, what works, and being okay with the fact that, hey, we're going to figure this out, we're going to try this out. If it doesn't work, we're going to abandon it before we institutionalize the process, because why would we want to do an institutionalized process that's destined to fail when we could invest in other things that maybe will work more effectively for us? And the only way that an institution can do that is to be informed. They have to be informed, and they have to be learning organizations, not just data creators, right? How many of your institutions, show of hand, have a data problem? You just don't feel like you have enough, right? Nobody. You're swimming in it, right? Like those of you who are, maybe from the IT side of things are like, if I collect one more piece of data, right? Like, and unfortunately, like the reality is there's only going to be more of it, right? We're going to generate more and more and more, and it's going to be at our fingertips. But we've got to do something with it, and we've got to be learned in that process and be willing to commit. So some of the tools that schools like Northern Arizona University utilize is begin to think about all of those components. If you're tracking events, right? If you're tracking all these notations, what if you gave them categories or tags, right? And then you could begin to see things like not just how are we doing on the non-cognitive side of things, right? Which is a very important piece of information we can equip our faculty members with, or our student success personnel with, which is really helpful, because think about it, now that you've grouped students, and we were talking to a faculty member, this was fantastic the other day. We were talking to a faculty member at an institution, and her plea for us was, look, it's not just about like the grading, just tell me something I don't know about my students. And I was like, that's powerful, right? What you're asking us to do is kind of show you things from a faculty potential point of view, and it's really started thinking our thinking around this is, what if we showed you student non-cognitive performance by the students who are in your class? Like, what if we told you right away that, not who, but maybe 25% of your class are scoring low in educational commitment. So guess what? If they're in your class and they have low academic engagement scores, what I am doing to you today, right now, is probably bad, right? Technical issues, preaching to the choir kinds of things, like not going to be effective. You're going to have to up your game when it comes to academic engagement. Now, we're not telling you that Matthew here is not engaged in your class, right? That's a potentially different set of tools, different set of systems. But on day one, what if we painted a profile that said, of the 50 people who are in your class, this is what is there? Because you may creating organizational components. So we started breaking this down in order to make it kind of cohort specific. So every advisor who looks at this gets a different breakdown of their students around those non-cognitive factors. Because what we didn't want to do is say, hey, look, the entire freshman population who are coming into your institution, have low academic engagement scores, but high campus engagement scores, and medium low resiliency scores. Plan interventions now, right? That's good. That's more data than you maybe had previously. But what we realized in talking to campuses is like, okay, but what if my students are different? Right? What if my students actually are perfectly fine with academic engagement, but they're actually really low when it comes to the campus engagement score? If I planned the way you told me about the entire freshman class, I would miss the mark. I would be telling them about more information that they were already potentially comfortable with, but missing where they needed the assistance. So breaking those things down, looking at kind of notations and time flows of those things, and beginning to show you times of the years that these types of issues are beginning to emerge, or this type of documentation is beginning to be there, is really helping shape how institutions, both at a micro level, or at a micro level at the departments and the units, and as well as a macro level across the institution, are beginning to generate their interventions. Because again, I don't look at these platforms as, oh, we're giving you data analytics, so boy, your life's a lot better, right? I'm giving you data analytics, your life probably got a little worse. And what I mean by that is more responsibility on you to take action, because you now have more information. You have potentially better information at your fingertips. Why aren't you doing more? One of the slides we skipped over says that data is important. It's a powerful tool, but campuses are increasingly going to be judged based off what you do with it, not your ability to collect it. There was 10 years ago, it was how well were you at collecting it? Oh yeah, great. You can create stores and stores of data. Fantastic, wonderful for you, right? You have great assessment programs or great analytic programs because you can pack, binders and bookshelves and databases full of ones and zeros and reports. Great job. Those of you who've gone through accreditation recently know that that's flipped, right? Like that process alone has become, well, now tell me what you did with it, and you're in trouble, right, if you aren't doing things with it. And as that grows, so will the expectation of your ability to do things with the information that's there. So whether that's, turning that information into dashboards, or more importantly, kind of even turning it into interactive pieces of information that campuses have today, in the student success tools, beginning to think about how that can be even just a more engaging experience for people to consume so that they can put that there. So it's been an interesting journey with our colleagues at NAU and the other schools across the country who are utilizing the platform and as part of the Gates Initiative, because we've really begun thinking about what is it that they need and how can we better address those problems. So whether, again, it's information delivery, whether it's helping support those kind of core components of institutional conditions that support institution success, and the data world that creates has been a really powerful kind of opportunity for us. In fact, I'm really excited to leave here this afternoon, not because this isn't a wonderful event, but because in our office when I get back tomorrow, our representatives from one of our schools on the West Coast who've flown in because we want to have a conversation with them around kind of co-creation. Let's talk about the biggest problems you have when it comes to the data, whether it's getting to it or whether it's in how you use it, and let's work to solve that problem together in that approach. Because we can be really great at creating something, but if it doesn't meet your need, then it doesn't matter whether we created it or not. Let's put the power in the hands of people who are like, hey, how do we get faculty involved, right? How do we get faculty involved? And part of it was us saying, faculty, what do you want, right? And we've gotten impassioned teachers in the classroom who said, just tell me something about my students. To others who are, how can we better run administrative processes in that endeavor. So it's been a very interesting and powerful experience, and I think the way that campuses like Northern Arizona University and others are beginning to structure their approach is really beginning to weave the thread through the campus in a different way. That tapestry that gets created around student success isn't just program A, program B, all of the things we do are great, but program A and program B and all the things that we're doing every day help us learn something more about our students. Whether, again, it's what they're participating in, whether it's around them meeting our expectations or not, whether it's around, again, equipping advisors or people who are connected, whether they know it or not together, to create kind of a unified approach has been a very interesting ride. We're excited to support schools like NAU who are seeing kind of an increase in their retention rates because of the efforts that they're putting in. And anything that we can do or anything that can be done across campus to support that work, we ought to be doing. There's no question about that. Questions?
What's the cost to implement a program like that where you get in a picture of the file of a student? What time frame of the cost?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that the time frame is, I'd say you're probably looking at 3 to 6 months for an implementation of that type of an approach. You got to factor in a lot of different things, and every school's different, right? So we work with a very large community college in Florida, and I will tell you, it's not been 6 months, right? But it's because of process, right? We're trying to go in and retrain advisors or connect data streams. Like, they were one of our first schools that helped push us towards that there's no advising relationship center on campus, right? And so we actually had to work with them to create that and create the automation around it so that we knew what combinations of factors generated that decision and how we could exchange those things on we do it on a nightly basis with them. But we want to make sure that those kind of components reside. So it can vary there in that approach. Cost-wise, software cost is, depends on the size of school from that approach and can range, if you're a really large institution, to 30, 40, whatever the number may be, again, depending on options that you're going to take. I think one of the things to incorporate into that decision, I don't care what system you use, I care, but for this piece of advice, I don't care. Factor in all the things you need in order to make it successful, right? And whether that is more training that you need to do or pulling people together in order to reevaluate, and it's not a software training, it's a process training. So a good example with non-cognitives, we've had institutions who actually begin to retrain their advisors about how to use this data and incorporate it into their typical advising process. Because again, think about it, it's a different conversation. It's not just, I'm oversimplifying it, it's not just here are the courses and how are you doing and are you on track and boom, boom, boom. It's not a transactional conversation, right? It's a deepened and engaged conversation. So at times, your staff may need additional support in that. And I will tell you, that's just as important as the training that you're going, probably more important than the training you're going to do on the software. Because that is a process that, we may not even provide for you. You may have to, find consultants or folks on campus who can utilize that type of data set. But it's an important cost to consider because that does play into it.
I understand the broad spectrum approach to understanding student experience and making them successful or not. But a lot of the data I saw out there sounds like stalking to me. If I was a student and my academic advisor said, I see you're not going to the gym very much anymore, I'd go bananas.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a couple of things I would tell you about that. I don't disagree with you on principle of that. I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind, and this has actually been a very interesting transition, 3 years ago, at a minimum, 3 years ago, standing in front of you, giving you a presentation where I told you something about card swiping, you would throw something at me, right? Like, there was an overwhelming push from a lot of administrators who we work with on campus with the same thing. It's Big Brother-esque, it's unethical in some ways, and I was like, I'm not saying put something at the health center to swipe cards and drive it in here. Like, obviously make smart choices. Like, you're right, there's an ethical issue for you to consider. But at the same time, like, you're tracking this data. A lot of this information exists in a spreadsheet somewhere, right? It is there. And actually, as we've seen students evolve, this has also been a barrier that they're a lot more comfortable with in the process. That all right, I go in and I swipe my card. I know I've given that information to the world, or I'm checking into something. The thing that we do to try to help mitigate that process is access, right? So you may not give everybody full access to those pieces of equipment. You may choose as an institution not to wire rec center data in, as an example, to the process from that type of component. But there are tiered access rules that I think are important. But I think you've raised a really great point about the institution has to think about its data structure and governance, regardless of the systems you're using. Think about who needs what pieces of information and how are you making sure that you're doing good with that information and making sure it's getting to the right places. Any other questions? Fantastic. Thank you for bearing with me through the first part of this.